Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is the International Peace Coalition. This is our 129th meeting that we've had consecutively. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Anastasia Battle. I'll be your moderator today, as well as Dennis Small and Dennis Speed, the co-moderators. And I like to remind people every week why we created this forum, which quite frankly, as many who have been in the peace movement for a long time know, it's been quite dysfunctional, lots of infighting, people of many different philosophies fighting amongst each other. But if we're actually going to stop nuclear World War III, if we're actually going to stop genocide, we have to collaborate together. Uh, People of many different philosophies, religions, languages, cultures have come together in this forum in order to accomplish the same goal, and that's our mission for true peace on the planet. So we welcome you if that is your mission. We want to encourage people, especially if you're new, to join us during the discussion period. Introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, if you're with any organization, and if you have any initiatives to present to everyone. So please feel free to do that during the discussion period. And thank you to the veterans who have been part of this process over 129 weeks. It's very important. And please take a moment to share the invitation, whether that's the Zoom, the YouTube, the Rumble, Twitter X, whatever platform you're on. Share the link for this meeting today. It's going to be very important regarding the breaking shifts that are happening around Venezuela, the collapse of the global financial system, and the solutions to this crisis currently to stop the drive for nuclear war on many fronts. So please take a moment to do that. To start us off today, we have Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who is the founder of the Schiller Institute and the initiator of the International Peace Coalition. Please go ahead, Helga.
Yes, hello, thank you, and good day to all of you. The world strategic situation remains one of many contradictory developments. On the one side, we have the still looming danger of something happening with Venezuela. We had yesterday a very important and successful emergency seminar where we had representatives from Venezuela, from Brazil, from other countries of Latin America and United States, discussing what can be done to convince President Trump. Don't do it, President Trump, was the title of the seminar. And what came out very clearly in the discussion is that the pretext that it is Venezuela involved in pushing fentanyl into the United States or even large amounts of cocaine is exactly that, a pretext, and that the beans were spilled by the Foreign Affairs magazine, which clearly says that the real aim is regime change in Venezuela to drive out a post for the influence of China, Cuba, Iran, and Russia, namely the BRICS. And also solutions were discussed very clearly that the key to overcome all of these problems like migrants, poverty, and tensions is a cooperation between the United States with the BRICS. We will get a report back on that session by Dennis Small in this present discussion. So obviously, the big topic which put itself on the agenda at the same time is the 28-point plan to bring a peace solution to the Ukraine, to end the Ukraine war. Now, emotions are flying high around that proposal, where it seems that this is really the old proposal, which was discussed between Steve Witkoff and Kirill Dmitriev in Miami, end of October. And it is basically, it was not confirmed that there was a consultation with Russia beyond that. However, the proposal is obviously one which some people say would mean a complete capitulation of Ukraine. I don't see it that way because, on the ground, militarily, Russia is moving forward so massively that, it is a very short question of a very short time when the Ukraine forces cannot any longer keep fighting, also because of a complete lack of troops, leave alone ammunition. There is also a mood in the population whereby only 24% of the people polled want to continue the war, while 69% want to end it as quickly as possible, because it is a war of attrition, and the losses have amounted to a level of that is absolutely intolerable. Now, what this 28-point proposal includes is that Russia would get certain parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, which is still controlled by the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians will have to give up some of the territory which has not yet been conquered by Russia. But on the other side, parts of Cherson and Zaporozhye, which is occupied by Russia, would be given back to Ukraine. Other points are that Ukraine absolutely cannot join NATO. Russia would guarantee that it's not planning to attack any other countries. Weapon systems in Poland and Romania, which are regarded as threat to Russia, would be pulled back. And Ukraine would have no long-range weapons capable of reaching deep into the territory of Russia. The US would give security guarantees to Ukraine in return. Russia would be able to be reintegrated into the global economy, and all sanctions would be lifted. In any case, there are many more points. And obviously, this is the result of almost 3 years of war. Naturally, Zelensky is not happy with it, but in a discussion he had with the U.S. Secretary of the Army, Daniel Driscoll, he more or less, agreed that this would be a point of negotiation. Naturally, the coalition of the willing in Europe freaked out completely. Merz, Macron, Starmer got on the telephone with Zelensky today. And, there are mixed signals, because part of it is that several of the European leaders are on their way to South Africa to participate in the G20 meeting. So it was a little bit back and forth. For example, Foreign Minister Wadefuhl said something a little bit different, saying, that anything which ends to the war, which will end the war, is welcomed. In any case, it is not clear what will be the result of all of that. The Italian army former head of the special forces, also in Afghanistan, Bertolini, he said that if Ukraine does not accept the end of the war through such a negotiation, some Europeans want to turn Ukraine into a new Afghanistan for Europe. Now, that was 20 years of mindless, meaningless killing, and by the end of it, Afghanistan was completely destroyed. So if that's what should be the fate of Ukraine, it definitely would not be something to look forward to. Now, obviously, the situation in the Middle East remains one of ongoing killing. There have been anywhere, I think, more than 30 people killed, 600 wounded. It's very difficult to judge. In any case, the US resolution in the UN Security Council was voted with Russia and China abstaining. But the situation absolutely is not clarified at all, because the massacring of Palestinians goes on not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. but we will hear a much more detailed report from that about that from Professor Falk. Now, obviously, by just touching on these various crisis spots, it is obvious that while the Venezuela disaster has not yet happened, while the terrible results of almost 3 years of war in Ukraine are not yet, we are not yet out of danger zones, because it's not yet clear what will be the result by the reaction of this war coalition of the willing. The Middle East remains a horror show. All of that just underlines our continuous point that we absolutely need to move the entire situation into a new paradigm, that it is not enough to try to find solutions to regional crises, but that we have to go away from geopolitics. We have to end a system whereby a collapsing neoliberal system is trying to prevent the rise of China, the rise of the BRICS countries in their effort to create a new economic system. And we have to convince the European countries and the United States that the only way how we will end without a catastrophe is that these countries must join with the global majority and cooperate in solving all the problems of poverty, of migrants, of many regional tensions by cooperation. And that is the new trend of the time. Now, I think we can be optimistic that it is the global majority representing 85% of the people who want to have a new system of cooperation. And we should remember that it's also the base of President Trump, the MAGA base, who wanted Trump to end the endless wars, and who for sure will not support that he would start a new war in Venezuela. So we have to connect the people of Europe and the people of America with the global majority, and then every problem can be solved. Now, there is unfortunately both the head of the army in France and also the general inspector of the Bundeswehr in Germany are making absolutely bellicose statements. The French Mandon basically said France has to be prepared to sacrifice its children, or else we are in danger. And the German General Spectre said we have to be ready to fight tonight. So these people are still on an absolute unwinnable, illusionary war path. But one can also report that a very broad alliance of organizations just managed to stop the presentation of a Bundeswehr representative in the Berlin clinic Charité, where he wanted to give a presentation on how the hospitals have to be prepared for the coming war. And a very broad coalition was able to disinvite him and stop this. So that should be seen as a small but significant sign that people can succeed in, bringing down the arm even of the strongest tyrant if they unite for a good plan. These are the words of Friedrich Schiller in his account of the fall of the Netherlands from the Habsburg Empire. And he said, I'm telling you about this story so that people have hope that you can win against such tyrants. So I want to stop here and basically say that, we absolutely have to increase our efforts in the International Peace Coalition, because long will not be left before the financial system collapses. And if we don't have a reorganization of that in time, that could trigger an uncontrollable situation as well. So that's my initial remarks.
Thank you very much, Helga, for that very thorough overview for everyone on the discussion today. I'm going to make a slight adjustment on the agenda today, and unfortunately, Mr. Fuller can't join us today, just so people know, the ones who are translating the agenda. But next, I'd like to bring in Diego Sequeira from Venezuela. He is a journalist, I apologize, a researcher and columnist for the missionverdad.com. And you were just on the discussion yesterday, this emergency roundtable, which I watched. I was very impressed with what you and others went through and the overview of why this is happening. So thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Siqueira. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Very happy, sorry, to be here. Hold on. Yeah, to be here once again, and try to brief you as best as I can, given the current situation. Regarding our Venezuela right now, I think if you see it from where we stand as normal Venezuelans about their own business, like it is daily now, it feels kind of like we're still, regardless of the sort of heavy movements we saw yesterday regarding, for example, some new bombing rehearsals with some, I don't remember what plane it was, I think a B-2 or something. Once again, they've been doing this periodically, which is approaching the Venezuelan shores, turning off the transponders, and then heading back in order to rehearse probable long-range airstrikes. But this, funny enough, goes along with a very substantial development if it actually comes through, which I think it's important, which is statements by President Trump regarding the possibility of dialogue with Venezuela, which of course it was, yes, well received by the Venezuelan government, by our president Nicolás Maduro, especially because this has always been the position of the Venezuelan government regarding U.S.-Venezuela relationships. It has always been a key demand that if we're going to talk as equals, not as subordinates, not as a rogue actor, not as something beyond the state, which is basically what they're trying to procedurally brand us in order to, skip all the war procedures that should be scanned, screened, analyzed by Congress. That's the whole purpose, basically, of, shifting the paradigm and turn away from the classic Wilsonian approach of saying the problem is dictatorship and we need to bring democracy and civilization or whatever. And this actually is more of a Rooseveltian kind of approach. And basically create all this now clear enough fake lies and arguments in order to explain why they are onto Venezuela. This, of course, it reproduces something that has been actually the actual pattern before the buildup in September, which is a two-track approach to Venezuela, which is pretty much also ingrained with Trump's proper approach, as in, mafia style. For once, I can break your leg, but on the other, let's just talk. Anyway, that's good enough for us, and we're actually still not that impressed about the demonstration of force. But this is a very important development, and there are many countries in the region willing to also mediate between this hypothetical possible dialogue between Venezuela and the U.S. Brazil and the CARICOM countries are just two of these examples, but I think there's sadly, a very important caveat to all this, which is, and it's a bit worse. Trump said the same thing a few days before the Israeli aggression against Iran. And given also the fact that this is not, up to this point, a leader and a government that doesn't deliver their own words, it's a bit concerning. It could also go the way it should. It could go the other way, and maybe something more kinetic should happen. Because talking about the two-track approach or even situation, as we talked about it yesterday, Dennis was the one who brought that subject with Marco Rubio pushed now the definition of El Cartel de los Soles, the bogus fake Cartel de los Soles, as a terrorist organization, which widens up the legal and political possibilities of action against Venezuela. So it's a bit further in the same situation without a significant resolution. I want to address before another element that I think was important that we didn't actually mention yesterday, but I think it's as important and also links up to something that's also on the happening right now, which is Venezuela's economic recovery, which includes an oil production recovery. These last 2 quarters of the year, Venezuelan oil production reached finally above the million barrels mark, which is something that is substantial regarding how battered and how embattled it has been for the last 5 years. This is a major development, which I think it also explains among all these several layers that we're dealing regarding Venezuela, regarding the region, regarding the regional change attempt, regional reshaping attempt, that also explains the push, maybe the haste of someone like Marco Rubio, not only because of his personal situation right now as being probably one of the most powerful U.S. officials in a long time, you know, having the State Department, having the National Security Council, but also being the administrator of the remainings of USAID. So this is a huge amount of leeway to do whatever he wants, overt and covert at the same time. But I think this is very important. As many of you might recall, back 5 years ago, Venezuela's inflation was somewhere around the central bank, Venezuelan central bank number, it's 130,000% of inflation. I mean, it's just, that also shows how unnatural this situation is and what it and where it comes from. And now it's very much tamed under a one-figure percentage, and also, which is, I think, is as important, it's now one of the fastest growing economies in the hemisphere. I think this is important. I want to, if you allow me, link it up to something else that has a lot to do with Venezuela, regardless of how it's not that obvious. And I'm thinking about Nigeria at this current moment. As you remember, there's now this talks about the fundamentalists of Boko Haram and so forth genociding Christians in northern Nigeria, which of course is partially true in the sense that these people basically kill everyone, be it Shia, be it Sunni, be it atheists, being Christians. I mean, it's not specifically a Christian thing, but it shows very interesting elements to it. One of these, of course, is, I don't know if you're aware, but you might know who Aliko Dangote is, which is like this nationalist billionaire and oil entrepreneur from Nigeria, just basically built the first, it's up and running, the first national refinery. Nigeria wasn't able to refine its own crude up until this point, which is a massive sign of internal development, which is very significant. It was against many odds to reach this point. Also, you have the obvious Chinese card here, which is major contracts regarding infrastructure, regarding port infrastructure, railroads, and so on. The usual portfolio that China could offer an African country at this moment. And then you have a third element here, which is a bit more ethnical, that I think it's as important as the rest, and I think they're not saying it. As you all know, northern Nigeria, ethnically, it's mostly Hausa, which is, yes, desert and Muslims, which is, by the way, the majority of the neighboring country there, the northern, up in Nigeria's north, which is Niger. And of course, that's also the Sahel Belt, which includes, of course, Burkina Faso and Mali, currently on a very tough war against quote-unquote terrorism. You know, these are basically gangsta Islam, drug dealing terrorists that bring drugs over to Europe, and they're very well connected to Ukrainian terrorists and Western spooks of sorts, be it French, be it British, or be it from the U.S. But Nigeria also shares a common structural feat with Venezuela. Nigeria is, of course, a petrostate. It's a state like Venezuela that you are not going to there's not a major significant difference between state and government at the same time. And the creation of wealth is based on oil. So this happening at the same time, I think it's quite descriptive of the situation. Now, coming back to the Western Hemisphere, you can also see, we can definitely, I mean, I think it's accurate and correct the way it has been addressed by the EIR, the EIR and the Peace Coalition, which is a Caribbean crisis. Of course, Venezuela is the flashpoint. There's no doubt about that currently. But if you follow the successive extrajudicial killings that we've seen against small seamen from Venezuela, we don't know if they're fishermen. We don't know if they're actual smugglers, which is possible. We do know that they're not moving fentanyl, and we do know that these small boats are unable to reach U.S. shores. So that's one more time, you can prove that the truth is nothing important here. It's not a post-truth thing. It's not. It's just, and it's not as quote unquote sophisticated as the Iraq dossier in 2003, which was a bit more elaborate in the way to justify or to create or to push this line. This is far more simple and vain, I think. But if you see the most recent attacks were actually on the Eastern Pacific, and we're actually targeting undeclaredly, without saying, Mexican fishermen. And so this expands the scope of the military criminal pressure that we're going through. And it goes beyond, one more time, Venezuela. This has been expanding all this time. Another element, which is I would like to address, it's thinking about yesterday's emergency seminar, and I think it's important, especially on the matter of President Trump, don't do it. I would like to bring something I, in several interviews, I've been bringing over once and again, which is there's this small paper from a very shady Miami think tank called the Miami Strategic Intelligence Institute, which clearly seems like a spook cutout for me, if you ask me. It is run by a guy called Jesus Romero, who was, I mean, I'm gonna try to remember all his resume, but it includes, for example, working for Northrop Grumman, Booz Allen Hamilton. He was a naval intelligence officer, and he was head of the Interagency Task Force South, which is the entity that coordinates all the sub-letter agencies of the intelligence community regarding contraband, drug trafficking, and crime in the Caribbean. Well, so this guy writes a paper in late July, well before this, in which he assesses according to him, this current state of the Venezuelan anti-air defenses. The funny thing is that he bases his assessment on very outdated data from 5 years. Perhaps the worst moment that the Venezuelan situation was. I'm talking about 2020, 2019. And of course, everything was, quite vulnerable. And saying that all our radars and so forth are under, 50% of functionality and whatever, and preparedness. And also that all of these have been used exclusively for the interest of the Cartel de los Soles, which of course it's another classic spin already. But the thing is, it's a very, very short document, and it has a very important money quote for me at the end. It's just 2 lines that I'm paraphrasing, but basically it says that air support to an internal insurgency inside Venezuela will succeed throughout the country, but in Caracas. And also, if I might add up, for a very important source, I confirmed that Jesus Romero, of course, is very close to, like we said yesterday, the guy who's actually running the show in this sense, which is Marco Rubio. It's very close to it's a Miami Institute for, it's a clear Florida neocon thing. But the thing is that if all of you remember how Bolton got to be National Security Council back then, it was also by a very short piece suggesting very short and simple ideas that were easily for Trump to, to acknowledge them and bring him into the fold. And I think that's basically it. I mean, I think this was actually the point in which they suggested that Rubio laser focused Trump on the Venezuelan dossier and said, this is our slam dunk. This is how possible this is. And mind you that if we peruse some of the most recent reports, well, it depends on what side of the bipartisan spectrum you are, each and every one of them, first of all, warn of the dangers of occupation, the dangers for U.S. servicemen of occupying or invading Venezuela, and even the formidable defenses in that sense. And I'm now thinking of a CSIS piece from last week, written by, I forgot the name, some Air Force colonel in this case. And they also strongly recommend that it should be long-range attacks because of the vulnerabilities that all the buildup has if they reach too much close to the shore. And also at this point, which is where the point I want to reach, is they all rely on the fact that they need something inside Venezuela happening in order to ease things up, in order to make it easier to conquer basically by collapse, which is like the obvious maximum pressure rationale, as we saw, for example, in Syria in 2024. But this isn't happening. This is, I think, it's the most important thing I might say. If you walk through Caracas, I work in a very bustling area of Caracas, and people are far more concerned about holidays, which is basically sacred here in Venezuela, about getting the money for the holiday season and for having a good time, basically, and also struggling, of course, with the value of our currency, which this is I think it's the most important impact that the whole building has been affecting since the start, which is plunging the price of the Bolivar vis-a-vis the dollar. Now, for example, it's $1, 250 bolivares, I think is the correlation right now. And tomorrow it will be 260, 270. And
Wow.
early December, it's going to be 300 bolivares, which is very painful and frustrating. But still, we're used to this as well. So,
Mr. Sequeira,
yes,
just because we have a few other people in the lineup, could you take just a minute or two more, and then
yes,
we'll definitely come back. There are people already sending in questions. You're provoking people.
Sure, no worries.
But yeah, no problem.
Yes, I was wrapping up anyways. This was the point I wanted to deliver home. So yes, this is basically where we at. If you see it from the outside of Venezuela, it looks as ominous as it actually is. But if you see it from Venezuela, it kind of doesn't seem like nothing is happening. And this is something that we've been through before. Of course, the main difference is the buildup, including the Gerald Ford just a few miles away from our shores. So thank you very much. I'll be here anyways.
Great, thank you. No, thank you very much for this overview. This is very, very helpful. I'm sure many people here find this incredibly useful because we're not there. We don't hear what's actually happening on the ground, what's happening inside Venezuela, and what the impact that's actually happening inside the nation right now is, and what the real intentions are. So thank you so much for going through what you went through. I'll bring in Dennis Small, who is a collaborator of yours. He's with the Executive Intelligence Review, and he is the head of the Ibero-American Desk. Please go ahead, Dennis Small. You have the floor.
Okay. Thanks, Anastasia. Thanks, Diego, for your report. Your comments at the end, or close to the end, about Nigeria, I thought were particularly interesting and important to emphasize for people. In one sense, this has nothing to do with Venezuela, nothing to do with Nigeria, nothing to do with the Caribbean. it has to do with a threat to a system that is collapsing, imploding upon itself, and cannot stand the possibility of alternatives arising, such as the BRICS, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, such as the idea of a new security and development architecture, and therefore has to establish a precedent for coming down with a mailed fist against any expressions of a contrary view. And this is the case in various parts of the world. So what I would like to do is to just give people, highlight a couple of points from yesterday's EIR Emergency Roundtable discussion. And people should just go back and listen to it. It's available in English and Spanish at this point. That has over 5,000 views in the two languages on various platforms. What I think I want to say about this is that this was the entire concept of Westphalia in action. Now, not to overblow this and to say that this one meeting was going to bring about an entire new system, but the principle involved of individuals who represent different points of view, different countries, often countries that have been in conflict with each other, coming together around a much higher common purpose. And just so that people are aware, the participants in this was led off, of course, by Helga. Diego Sequeira, who you've just heard from Venezuela, spoke, as did Morela Barreto Lopez, who is a Venezuelan diplomat and historian speaking in her personal private capacity. Donald Ramotar, former president of Guyana, Ray McGovern of the United States of the VIPs, Beto Almeida, Brazilian journalist, and myself, and Diane Sayre as a commentator as well. The fact that the president of Guyana, former president of Guyana, was there with a couple of spokesmen from Venezuela talking about issues that have nothing to do with the actual historic 100 years long dispute between their countries was extraordinarily important. And it was emphasized and signaled from the very outset by Diego himself, who greeted the neighbors to the east and the south, meaning Guyana and Brazil. Brazil has also had some political difficulties with Venezuela. It was also stated explicitly by Morela Barreto, where she stated her grateful appreciation to everyone, but especially her thanks to President Ramotar. And this is very important because the idea of integration, the idea of a higher purpose, of a goal that is beyond the simple individual interests of each country, not to disrespect those interests, but to look for a higher solution, was not only the focus of this meeting, it was the spirit of the meeting. And I think that really jumped out at everyone. Beto Almeida from Brazil was emphasizing over and over and over again the importance of dialogue and the importance of integration, the need for integration of the nations of South America. I quoted Lyndon LaRouche, who back in, I'm going to look for the full quote here because I pulled it up for this occasion, who back in a visit to Brazil that he and Helga made back in 2002, in one of his addresses to the country, which was on the occasion when he had been given the keys to the city of Sao Paulo, which is either the largest, the second largest, or the third largest city in the world. And he was honored at a ceremony for that. What Lyndon LaRouche said, among other things, is we in the United States are in a mess, a terrible mess. We have great power still, but it's a sham. Without the revival of the economies of South and Central America, the United States cannot work its way out of its own unrushing depression. Either we shall sail together or we shall sink together. And I think that idea of sailing together or sinking together is exactly the whole concept of Westphalia and the whole concept of what Helga has presented in her 10 principles for a new security and development architecture, that there is always, as Nicholas of Cusa explained and taught us, a higher level way to think about things that provide a solution. And that's what we saw in action here. Helga's development in the course of the event, and in particular her conclusion around this concept of the role of Cusa and the principles involved, I thought were particularly significant. So that was one thing that jumped out at me. Another thing was the very much appreciated, speaking as an American, understanding from our Latin American friends that the United States is not a single thing, just as the countries of Latin America are not a single thing. We have differences in our country. There are factions, there's history. And the level of appreciation of that from Beto Almeida, from Diego, from Morela was, I think, very important. The emphasis on the history of some of this. Beto Almeida talked about the role of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And let me just say parenthetically, for those who are just listening to Diego, when he talked about the Rooseveltian approach, he was not talking about the Franklin Delano Roosevelt approach. He was talking about the Teddy Roosevelt approach, the Roosevelt corollary, which he is quite clear on, and he talked about that some in our discussions yesterday. But the Franklin Delano Roosevelt approach, for example, to Brazil, it was Roosevelt's support for Getúlio Vargas in Brazil that made the development of the entire steel industry in Brazil possible, and the development of an industrial modern Brazil. It was also Roosevelt's approach, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's support for Mexico in the nationalization of oil under General Cardenas, which made it possible for Mexico to nationalize its oil against British interests and lay the basis for the modern nation state. So this distinction was absolutely present, and in my view is of great importance, because as Diego was saying then, yesterday, and again today, on the one hand, there is the approach taken by Grenell, who is one of Trump's envoys in this, to try to work out some negotiated settlement, but who has been sidelined. On the other hand, we have the approach of Marco Rubio, who is not the one making the policy. That's coming from the City of London and Wall Street, but he is certainly the one carrying it out. He is, in addition to being Secretary of State, and in addition being head of the National Security Council, and also the leftovers of the whole USAID apparatus, he's the head of the National Archives. So that has some significance as well, which may come out in the discussion period. So that's another aspect. Another aspect of what was discussed, which came across very clearly in pretty much every presentation, was what the cause of this is. And I was referring to that by picking up on what Diego just said about Nigeria. Many people ask, EIR ask, the Schiller Institute have certainly asked me, friends in Latin America, are they really that crazy to do something like this? And I've repeatedly emphasized that it's the wrong question. The question is, are they that desperate? And yes, they are that desperate because of the collapse of the financial system, all $2 quadrillion of it. And that is what's driving ultimately the desperation. And behind and closely related to this financial crash is the issue of drugs. There's definitely an issue of drugs involved in this Caribbean threat, but it isn't Venezuela's role, which, like any country, has this problem. It's the banks. It's Wall Street. It's the City of London. And we should not be talking certainly about the Cartel de los Soles, the Suns cartel, or the Sinaloa cartel, or the Cali cartel. Let's talk about the City of London cartel and the Wall Street cartel. That's the center of the actual international drug trade. Now, I want to say one final thing about this. Diego Sequeira and I are not old friends. We're new friends. I first talked to Diego Sequeira on Sunday. Today is Friday. Is that right? It was Sunday, I think. Now, this is interesting because this meeting, which EIR organized, was an emergency roundtable discussion. We decided on it Saturday. We began to organize it Sunday. We publicly announced it Monday. And an event on Thursday, we pulled together online watching this, about 1,000 people from 30 different countries at least, between the Zoom platform, YouTube in English and Spanish. It was co-streamed by Garland Nixon in the United States. There are now over 5,000 people who have seen this. Diego and I spoke because we had many mutual friends, because EIR has a long history. The LaRouche movement has a long history in Iberoamerica. And we discussed many things. We haven't yet come to discuss our differences, but that's going to happen very soon, I'm sure, because we're serious people, and so are our friends in Latin America. And these are the issues that have to be discussed out. So this kind of Westphalian approach, pulling together people from all sorts of different approaches, is not only possible now. I think what this showed, just as our emergency roundtable on the Bering Strait question, it provided a solution around the concept of the Caribbean development that we presented. It provided pointing to the real danger, the real enemy, and the basis for coming to a common approach above the specifics of any particular national situation. And I think that's a principle which applies everywhere in the world today. It's not just the Caribbean, it's everywhere. And that is the guiding principle behind the IPC. If we can wield that principle, which is now coming into its own because of the nature of the crisis, and because we have people on today, there will be 250 to 300 people who have been involved in this discussion from 35 or 40 countries. That is our baseline of capabilities to make this work internationally. I'm saying this because every single person listening and participating in these discussions has to realize that is the power which you wield along with the rest of us. And we should be conscious of it. We should wield it. We damn well better wield it quickly, or we're not going to have that power for long, because we're not going to have a world for long. So those are my thoughts after yesterday's event.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for that. And I'm including in the chat here, if you're on Zoom, where you can go and watch the recording of the video roundtable discussion with, actually, you'll see Mr. Seguera and Dennis Small in there as well as other IPC participants. So please definitely take a look at it, get it out. If you are a journalist, please feel free to use it. Or if you'd like to repost it, please reach out, let us know, but you are welcome to use it. Just give credit to the Executive Intelligence Review. I know that there is, I wanted to go to Dennis Speed, who had a question regarding this whole process for Mr. Seguera. You there, Dennis?
Yeah, hi, you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I did have a question. This is a question actually both is for Mr. Sequeira, but also is now for Dennis and for Helga. Nigeria is an interesting case because while people would purport to say that it was about oil, Nigeria will be the most populous country in the world in 25 years. We're talking about what could be as much as 1 billion people or more. And that nation's population's median age at that time is going to be 25 years. Half of the people are going to be under 25 years old. I mean, right now, throughout the continent of Africa, half of the people are under 19. So the interest in subjugating that nation in the same way that this has been true, we see it with Peru. We see it in terms of even Bolivia when they wanted to try to develop their nuclear power plant and so on, and what's been done there. And I'm reminded, Dennis is very aware of this, of Zbigniew Brzezinski talking about no Japans south of the United States border, and Henry Kissinger talking about history is not being made, is not made in the South. And so I sort of want to address that both to you, Mr. Sequeira. Dennis and Helga may also have a comment, because I think, just as we've said, that it's not really about Nigeria, Venezuela, whatever. Here we see a clear attempt to depopulate And I think this is very important. And to destroy. We used to had it in El Salvador with the Office of Population and Affairs of the State Department. A guy named Thomas Ferguson called for the elimination of all of the childbearing females, so on. So I pose that and just would like to see what you have to say.
I'll go first. I'll try to go first. Well, I think it's an argument pretty close to my heart in that sense, because as you are aware of, Venezuela and Venezuelan history or South American history, actually, it proved to be history changing back in the 19th century. I mean, that was the first cycle of, let's call it, decolonization in a classic sense of the word, not the new, the new coinage, which are quite confusing. And that was, I think it was a very, very important precedent that many people actually pushed against it. Actually, if the Amphicyonic Congress that was called by Simón Bolívar in Panama, 1826, it was undermined, of course, by whom? It was undermined basically by British and some U.S. agents through proxies from Colombia and Venezuela back then. And it also brings, if we bring it even closer to home now into this time and to this geopolitical thinking, I was just reminded also of the rimland theory of containing also all these possible rim powers such as Venezuela or Nigeria for that matter, in the sense of geography. And it also, and this is why it's also close to my heart, I think you are all very much aware of the Venezuelan migration situation for the last 5 years, and how this was actually a very conscious, a very mindful, and very well-structured attempt to drain and bleed out the country of its own population, and also to push a population that wasn't used to the migrating experience, which Venezuela was, at least for 100 years, a receptor country, not a migrant one. I mean, we have many waves of migrants from either South America or Europe, post-war Europe especially, or the Ottomans, by the way, ever since. So it was a very, very shocking and traumatic experience, and it already is. Now we have something called a Venezuelan diaspora, which is being quite weaponized against Venezuela itself, be it on the most demographic aspect or be it on the social media sphere, the perceptive narrative sphere. In a way, it was deeply weaponized, by the way, back in the 2024 presidential elections. It was a major asset of it. And of course, and I think it was very interesting also that this was inorganic to some extent. Of course, the whole problem of the economic woes and malaises that we were going through, and the hardship of livelihood day by day worsening into a very significant extreme, and coming from a very prosperous moment just a couple of years before, it was pretty traumatic. And how it was actually incentivized by so many. Actually, for example, there's this figure, this number, which is the one the UN uses. It was 7.9 million Venezuelans out of Venezuela. I actually contest this number. I think it's lower. It's still very high. I think it's scandalously high. I think it's closer to 5 million in this case. No one is actually also counting the people who came back to Venezuela after that. But the figure, the number, the calculation of this number was at least a year before the whole migrating, the whole exodus started. And it was done by a Brookings Institution paper, an assessment made by 2 Venezuelans. One is Douglas Barrios, which has been a Ivy League honcho ever since. And the other one was this guy called Danny Bahar, he's an Israeli Venezuelan, who actually, he was then talking about this, and the year after that, he was one of the most people defending the Venezuelan migration as a wonderful labor force, especially considering that also Venezuelan demographics are pretty close to the one of Nigeria in that sense. So there's another common feat to this. So it's a scandalous way to precisely engineer the possibilities of all these flashpoint areas that have proven in the past to be very powerful and significant players for the right reasons, for the right causes. And I do dare say the same thing about Nigeria, which also explains all this very tumultuous and turbulent historical time of one coup after another, one as bloody as the other, the successionist attempts in Biafra, and also in the Niger River Delta, which precisely shows how they need all these countries unable to stand enough on their own feet. And the case in point is Venezuela being, as of course, it was at the high point, at the upside of the commodity cycle that the Bolivarian Revolution was able to blossom the way it did, and to even have an impact on many unexpected quarters of the world, which includes, by the way, the ASA summit, the Africa South America summit, which had a very valuable and important guest, which was, of course, always so controversial, Muammar Gaddafi. And there was a year before the whole Sirte project and the idea of an African currency and the hub that Libya was going to fund regarding Africa back then. So, and this is 2 years before El Comandante's death, which was a before and after moment for us, absolutely, because everything changed afterwards. Actually, Misión Verdad was born after this because we had to take 2 steps back and ask the basic questions, because we were facing something new. We were facing precisely what Mr. Speedy just said about this social engineering of massive scale, which I think it relates, and I'm pretty sure any one of you can remind me of this document, which is from this, I think it's a 200 memorandum by the National Security Council under
Yes. Yeah, 1974.
Exactly. And I think it makes absolute sense. And you can even connect this even to why there was someone squealed where Hassan Nasrallah was the day he went into the meeting in the building and he was eliminated. It was based on the same kind of desperation and destitution that makes each and any moral compass, each and any cosmological horizon to make sense and to going forward. And I think it's interconnected precisely on that kind of engineering that you addressed. And I think I addressed more or less the point.
Yes.
Question. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Diego, for your thoughts on this. I want to go to Helga, if you have any comment or reflections.
Yeah, only briefly. I think, if you would ask the majority of people in Europe if they are racists and colonialists and imperialists, they would probably say, "Oh no, we are not like that." But if you look at the actual underlying axioms of the behavior, I think people have not yet really worked through that they are used to a world system which for 500 years treated the countries of the global south as colonies where it was quite okay if there would be poverty, no fresh water, that's just the way it is. And I think that I think one of the most urgent things for people in the north to learn is that there is a dramatic shift, which the genie is out of the bottle and you cannot put it back. You have to accept the fact that the rightful right of all nations to develop their full potential, that they are now insisting that they are going to do that. And given the fact that China is the country which has helped them and has done something which Europe did not do and the United States did not do. I mean, they could have easily helped infrastructure development in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, but they didn't. And only after China made this spectacular rise, now these countries have a partner with whom they can overcome their own lack of development. And I think the key problem of the peace movement is really, to have a much more conscious need for, and that's why we have been pushing the dialogue of civilizations and cultures so much, because if you don't make the effort to learn about the other cultures, you don't understand it. And that's why I think we should probably think how we can bring in the International Peace Coalition this idea of the dialogue of cultures as a very conscious feature in the future in a major way.
Great, thank you. I'm sure many people who are on the discussion right now are definitely mulling this over and thinking about how to get this idea out. Thank you for that. So I think what we'll do is we'll continue on with the agenda and then we'll come back again for more questions that are coming in, which there's definitely a few more. Next, I'd like to go to Harley Schlanger, who is the president of the LaRouche organization and has been a close collaborator of Lyndon LaRouche for many years. You were his spokesman while he ran for president, which is absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us, Harley. Please go ahead. You have the floor.
I want to start with the comments from Dennis Small about what we're really looking at is the collapse of the system. And I'm going to be talking about the real story of Jeffrey Epstein, but I'm not going to be talking to you about sex and blackmail, but how the people who run the system have continued to try to extend its life by war and unleashing regime change and chaos, but also running operations to confuse and divert attention away from what they're doing. The Epstein case is one that's a perfect example of this. He's been in the news extensively since his death 6 years ago. And it's over and over and over appealing to questions of luxury, of sexual obsession, the celebrity worship of the population. And people missed the main point, which is that this was all an operation to cover what he was doing on behalf of the establishment that was facing a series of crises going back to 1971. And I have a longer article on this coming out in the EIR, but I'll just hit a couple of the key points. Because if you look at him, the real story has been suppressed. And the real story is that we've gone through a series of economic resets, moving further and further away from physical economy, from the production of the goods and machine tools and capabilities needed to sustain a population, into a speculative realm in which the rich get richer and everyone else suffers. And when these boom and bust cycles go to the bust phase, the establishment bankers get bailed out, the so-called too big to fail banks, and everyone else pays the price for that. Now, this began in 1971, and if you map Epstein's career onto this, you get a picture of what he was. Yes, he was a depraved guy. He had no moral compass. That's what made him so useful. And you could point to the depravity and say, yeah, this is a bad guy. But what was he doing? And in the moments when he was not chasing after and abusing young women, he was engaged at the front end of these resets to create a global system of central banker dictatorship, which would use financial innovation as the new form of imperial looting. Now, he got involved initially in the junk bond operation of Michael Milken. And the Milken thing is interesting. It's a long story. I won't go through the whole thing. But Milken figured out how to launder money from organized crime figures, the Lansky mob, the Purple Gang of Detroit, and so on, and use that money to do mergers and acquisitions and takeovers. And they created a group of people who essentially were on the front lines of this. And in the process, they bankrupted many corporations. They built up a huge amount of debt. And Epstein entered this in the late 70s, early 80s, working with Bear Stearns. And Bear Stearns was one of the first investment banks that went under in the 2007-2008 crash. Now, they used drug money to fund the takeovers because it was an ideal way to launder money. Then after that, you had the move toward collateralized debt obligations, mortgage-backed securities, another way to extend the money that was available without having to increase the equity in the system. Epstein was involved in that. He had his own private funds. Then the next phase is the current move to public-private partnerships, which is involved in the artificial intelligence sector, surveillance technology, and warfare. At each of these, Epstein played a key role, not the dominant role, but that's what he was involved in. So the question is, who funded it and who is protecting him? And here's where you see the interesting question. His first major backer was a guy named Les Wexner, called the Merlin of the Mall. He ran Victoria's Secret. He ran a whole series of other clothing companies that were also ideal for money laundering. Now, Wexner gave the power of attorney of his billion-dollar fortune over to Epstein. Why? Well, Epstein took that money and built up a network that was involved in the transition to the financial innovation of more and more speculation and less equity. When Epstein was arrested in 2007, 2008, and put in prison, Wexner said, gee, I knew nothing about this. How did Wexner get his money? Through basically a deal he made with Meshulam Riklis, who was part of the Lansky mob. And you find this thread throughout the Epstein operation. Now, the next point after that was that when he no longer had a sponsor, he went out and found a new one, Leon Black, who was the chief junk bond salesman for Michael Milken. This was in 2013. Leon Black gave Epstein $200 million in 5 years, supposedly for family financial planning. So if you track the money, what you find is that the people who were involved in drug money laundering and various other financial crimes were funding the Epstein operation. Now, what else? Arms trafficking. One of Epstein's clients was Adnan Khashoggi, the famous Iran-Contra operative. He also worked with Sir Douglas Leese, who was famous for the $40 billion deal he did for BAE with the Saudis, the Al Yamama deal. So you have British, Israeli, drug money, arms trafficking. And this is what you're looking at. This is what they want to keep out of sight. Now, also, he's now moving through, well, he's not there anymore, but he went next to Peter Thiel and signed a major deal with Thiel, one of his venture capitalist firms, because that's the next phase. How do you use private money to fund private-public partnerships, where you get the government to put money in the hands of people like Thiel, who create new technologies, the so-called tech sector, and artificial intelligence, which is another bubble. At the time of his death, this is what Epstein was moving into. And who was one of his big partners? Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel. So if you keep unraveling this and peeling the onion, what you find is that Epstein was a part of a network of common crooks. He worked for what were called the original gangsters, the Lansky mob. Went from that to work for the Wall Street gangsters like Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase, the so-called too big to fail bankers. Now they're investing in surveillance and metadata collection technology, censorship, and kinetic warfare. Now, just one other side note here. Who do they see as their main opposition? Well, one of the people they targeted was Lyndon LaRouche, and it was done through the Anti-Defamation League. I don't have time to go through the whole story of the ADL, But this is what used to be called Jewish organized crime, or more appropriately, the Zionist faction inside America that would do anything it had to make money, profits, and then launder the money to quote, go legit. Now, one example of that, when Milken's operation was shut down in 1989, who came to his defense? Alan Dershowitz, one of the Epstein buddies. And what did Alan Dershowitz say was the attack on Milken, what it was about? Not that he was destroying companies and losing homes for people. No, that Milken was the new democracy, was expanding the free market system. How? Methods of organized crime. And Dershowitz said that Milken was not guilty. He was the victim of an anti-Semitic attack. And that's why I bring up this ADL question. These are the very same people who attacked LaRouche going back to the mid-70s, when LaRouche put forward a way to break this power of the financial establishment from moving to reset, and instead go back to the American system in his 4 economic laws and the idea of mutually beneficial cooperation for great projects among sovereign nation states. So the actual story of Jeffrey Epstein is of a morally depraved man who was not just morally depraved because of his sexual mores or lack of morality, but for his willingness to do whatever he was told to do by his masters. And then that explains why he could hang out with people like Bill Gates, Bill Clinton, formerly Prince Andrew, and so on, because this was a network of the establishment that was doing everything they could to remain in power. And that included destroying the lives of millions of people, launching wars, regime change, drug epidemics, and so on. So that's the story, the real story that's coming out now. And it took a long time to get it out because the people who supported him and defended him and protected him are quite powerful. But they're losing that power now, as we see with the whole discussion going on in the question of Israel and also the question of Venezuela. You know, how it is that we have to form a basis of defending these countries from this common criminality.
Thank you very much, Harley, for going through this kind of amazing breaking story and what's happening. A lot of people are focusing on, you know, the immorality of the whole thing, but what you just went through really gets to the core on what these Epstein files really mean.
It's
thank
a
you
bigger
so much.
immorality.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much for doing that. Okay, well, I do have a short announcement. I did try to contact Professor Falk, Richard Falk. Unfortunately, he got tied up with a number of things and cannot be on today, sends his apologies for not being able to join us, but will absolutely join us next week. So please look forward next week to having Professor Falk on for the International Peace Coalition. So I think what we can do now, since I've got a ton of questions coming in for regarding everything we've gone through so far. I say we move on to questions and answers. It looks like, oh, Dennis Speed, you have a question for Harley.
I think we should go into the Q&A session at this point because there's a number of things that have come in, and
Yeah,
let's
Right,
proceed.
let's make the transition now. right,
yes.
That, and then I can get a start.
Okay, so if you are on over YouTube, Rumble, Twitter, wherever you are, you must be registered to join the Zoom session and be part of the discussion with the presenters today. You can do that by going to schillerinstitute.com. And right on the top of the page, there is a registration page. You just go onto that, register, and you will receive an email with the Zoom link, and you can participate during the discussion period. And with that, Dave, please let me know when we've cut the stream.